I'm Paul Owens, opinions editor of the Orlando Sentinel, and our guest today is Mark Wilson, who's the president and CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. The Florida Chamber of Commerce is the state's largest federation of employers, local and regional chambers of commerce and associations. It represents large and small businesses from every industry in every region. It's based in Tallahassee. Welcome, Mark.
It's great to be here again.
The Chamber has released what it's calling its 2016 competitiveness agenda, which reads to me like a list of priorities for the upcoming legislative session. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of the points on the agenda. The agenda endorses Governor Scott's proposal to cut $1 billion in taxes over the next 2 years. How can Florida afford a cut this big when areas like mental health and prisons are considered underfunded, and legislators are doing things like raiding money from Amendment 1 for operating expenses, and Governor Scott has proposed taking some of the money from affordable housing? So how do we fit $1 billion in tax cuts into a budget like that?
Well, first of all, Paul, thank you very much for having me here today. The Florida Chamber always appreciates the opportunity to talk about making Florida more competitive. So I want to get to your $1 billion question, and but I think what's important is context for it. I think if you look, Florida has added 1 million new jobs in 5 years, and nationally, Paul, 1 in 11 jobs in the United States that were added in 2015 were added in Florida. So for context to your question, Florida's economy continues to grow. And because our economy grows, when businesses do well, when businesses hire people, those people buy cars, they buy houses, they rent apartments. And of course, our economy in Florida, our tax revenues for government are largely driven by economic activity. We don't, as you know, have a personal income tax in Florida. So economic activity is what we have to do. So there will be a surplus in the Florida budget this year. And I completely want to support your assertion that there are many priorities. Taking care of children with unique abilities, dealing with mental health issues, figuring out how to solve the Medicaid problem that this state has, how to invest in infrastructure and transportation. So our belief is we have cut taxes 50 times in 5 years in Florida. And every time we cut taxes, contrary to what a lot of people would like to believe, our economy grows. And when our economy grows, we actually generate more tax revenue. We'd like to see teachers earn over $100,000 a year. We think they deserve that respect, and we want the best teachers teaching in Florida. We believe we need to invest more in mental health. We believe we need to invest in infrastructure. We need to do it in a smart way. And so we may not get the entire $1 billion tax package in 1 year. It might take a couple of years to do it. But a few years ago, we were here talking about diversifying Florida's economy. Agriculture, tourism, and construction are essential to the future of Florida. But so is life sciences and simulation and advanced manufacturing, and I could go on. But one thing that we are trying to do, and we have Governor Scott's full support, and we hope the legislature will agree, to eliminate corporate income taxes, the business tax for manufacturing and for manufacturing equipment, means that we can help bring more manufacturing jobs to Florida. These jobs typically pay about 15 to 20% higher than the average wage. For every 10 manufacturing jobs we can create in Florida, we create 20 non-manufacturing jobs through our ports, through logistics, through legal, through finance, and so the leveraging effect. So Paul, the Florida Chamber's argument would be by making Florida more competitive for the types of jobs, higher wage, higher skill jobs that we're trying to create, we'll actually grow more jobs and we'll actually generate even more tax revenue so that we can fully fund the types of programs that we need.
Now, the competitiveness agenda also supports Governor Scott's call for $250 million in business incentives. Why do we need $250 million, $250 million,
Right.
when New York, for example, offers $150 million, $100 million less, and Texas, which may be our stiffest competitor nationally, offers just $90 million.
Well, we have to be very careful with this one, Paul, because we see the day where there are no taxpayer-funded economic incentives at all. And our competitiveness agenda is trying to, over the next decade, through education reform, regulatory reform, legal reform, et cetera, we're trying to position Florida to be the state of choice for high-wage, high-skill jobs when there are no incentives at play. In the meantime, the reason the Florida Chamber helped start Enterprise Florida in the mid-90s is we knew that we needed to target 7 or 8 industries that grow high-wage jobs. So what we're talking about is an incentive only when we're going after a high-skill, high-wage industry. So we're not talking about all jobs. We're talking about the types of jobs that are going to help us diversify our economy in Florida. That's point one. Point two, when you look at other states like Texas, when you look at states like Arkansas with 3 million people investing tens of millions of dollars in these projects, the $250 million enterprise fund request is actually a multi-year request. We would like to put the dollars there now. We'd like to set aside the dollars now. And Paul, it's important, and the viewers that are watching this program, I think, will inherently understand this. When other states are looking at Florida, if we have $250 million in an incentive fund that's used for targeted job creation, everyone will be calling Florida saying, hey, you have no income tax, your schools are some of the best in the country, your infrastructure is some of the best in the country. Tell us more about, maybe instead of California, maybe instead of Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, maybe instead of Austin, we've heard what you're doing at UCF. Maybe we should be looking at Florida. But Florida has to come in with a big number. We want to be the #1 private sector job creation in the nation. And the very reason we helped start Enterprise Florida in the 90s is the very reason we think that $250 million, we're asking for it right now, and that would last for a couple of years. And so I think it's important that it's there so that the world can see we're serious about it, and that we don't have to keep going back through a legislative process every time a major operation looks at Florida.
Any other changes to the incentives programs that you would support?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when we originally created Enterprise Florida, the original idea was that we were going to be very targeted and very narrowly looking at a very specific set of industries. Like I said, life sciences, bio, alternative energy, modeling and simulation, manufacturing. And I think over the years, it's no one's fault, but over the last 20 years, sometimes we move away from that. And I think that what we would like to see is we would like to see an incentive scenario where there's $250 million in the fund, and that it is very limited and very targeted to high wage, high return, high skill type industries and jobs. In other words, we need to transform Florida's economy with this, not just simply put incentives on the table to attract jobs. That's not enough. That's what other states do, but that's not what Florida should do.
Now, I've been told by critics of this proposal that the return on investment standards that it would establish are actually less aggressive than the return on investment standards in current law.
Yeah, I have not heard that, and I would have a hard time believing that to be true. I will tell you, I have been part of a conversation in the last few years. If you look at the way Florida currently calculates its return on investment, I would make the argument, Paul, that we don't look long enough. If you're Google or Tesla or Apple, and you're looking at adding 5,000 jobs for a battery manufacturing, a research and development facility, you're going to make an investment that's actually going to last 30 years or more. So what we're interested in is looking at a return on investment scenario where we can go out even more than 10 years. And so I think there necessarily will be a discussion about return on investment. And let me just say one thing before we go any further on this. One thing that gets overlooked, in my opinion, too often is Florida has one of the most conservative approaches to incentives in the country. We require the job to be created first before an incentive is ever actually delivered to a company, to a job creator. In many states, they provide the incentive up front and have no real way to get that back later. Taxpayers in Florida win in this scenario because regardless of whether we change a return on investment requirement or not, if we take it up higher, we extend the period of time, the Florida taxpayer wins every time because the only way an incentive is paid out is if you actually create the jobs that you said you would create. The incentives, Paul, are paid on the back end, not on the front end, and I think that gets lost in translation.
Now, the agenda also calls for what you refer to as a science-based water policy.
That's right.
Does that mean that the Chamber supports the House Senate water bill that's ready for passage when the legislature convenes next week?
Yeah, it does. As you can imagine, we've been very involved in helping to craft a science-based water package. Mm-hmm. We were disappointed that it didn't pass last session. I think the votes were there, and I think if the session would have ended differently, I think two very important bills would have passed. I think the science-based water bill would have passed, and I think the bill to help children and families with special abilities would have passed. And so, Paul, the Florida Chamber is actually fairly optimistic that as the legislative session begins, we fully support the package put forward by Speaker Crisafulli and Commissioner Putnam and others, a comprehensive water policy. Keep in mind, we're going to add 6 million residents by 2030. Mm-hmm. We need 28% more water between now and 2030. And many people I know, they say, wait, we get more rain than any other state in the country except for Hawaii. You know, why do we have a water problem? The problem is we get it all at once. We get it all in 3 months. What we have to do is exactly the opposite of what California has done. California has invested billions in a politically driven, non-scientific way of addressing water, and now they have bigger water problems than they've ever had. We're actually recommending making major investments that are science-based in solving Florida's long-term water problems. Paul, the question you asked me earlier about economic development, the work we've done to reform education in Florida, the work we've done to have a globally competitive economic development platform, none of that will matter one bit if we don't maintain clean air and if we don't deal with a science-based water policy.
Now, what would you say to critics who argue that the bill doesn't go far enough to restore waterways or to conserve water?
Yeah, well, in some ways I would agree that this is going to be a long process. You know, with 6 million more people coming here and 28% more water, we need to get the framework of a science-based water policy moving forward. And in our perspective, you know, like many big, bold reforms in Florida, look at education reform, look at legal reform, look at tax issues. It's never finished. So what I would say to the critics, and by the way, I sit down with many of the people I think you're talking about on a fairly regular basis, and we're committed to a 10-year work-together strategy where we need to start somewhere. I have no question that in 2018, 2017, 2020, we'll be back again with, some people will call them glitch bills, some people will call them additional improvements. I'm excited that President Gardner and Speaker Crisafulli and others, I think, are going to move forward a comprehensive water package. I think it's 80% perfect, and I think that is an incredibly important standard of where we should start. You have nationally renowned scientists like Dr. LaPointe at Harbor Branch, you know, who spoke at our annual meeting this year and opened up a lot of our members' eyes to how important it is that we get the water issue right. And now's the time to deal with this when we can.
Okay. Now, last year, the Chamber calculated that Floridians with insurance, whether it's families or businesses that are providing insurance, we're paying 8% more for health care because of a cost shift from care for the uninsured. But it doesn't look to me from the competitiveness agenda that the Chamber is supporting, at least for this session, a plan to accept federal dollars to expand coverage for the uninsured. Why is that?
So I think if you look at the Florida Chamber's position on healthcare, as a matter of fact, our healthcare policy group is meeting all afternoon this afternoon to talk about this very issue in Tallahassee. I think what's important is we advocate accepting federal funds and having Florida create a private sector solution to get people covered. I don't think it would be accurate to say that the Florida Chamber is not pushing that. I think it would be accurate to say the federal government's not interested in that. We have talked regularly and robustly about a block grant, for example, where the federal government would send to Florida the same amount of dollars, and that they then would allow the business community and the legislative community and the healthcare community to cover that population in a way that honors people getting back to work, that honors people getting an education, that honors people working on advancing their career. It goes back to what I said earlier. When we help knock down the unemployment rate, when we help people get back to work again, whether it's part-time, full-time, what we're going to do is oftentimes those will come with benefits. And I would say this, there's enough money in the healthcare system today, and almost everyone universally agrees to that. The problem is we're spending it in areas that are not necessarily driving better healthcare outcomes. And so whether it's allowing nurse practitioners to prescribe medication if they're qualified to do that, whether it's the use of telemedicine, whether it's fixing our now broken medical malpractice laws again, or whether it's accepting federal funds, not to expand Medicaid, but accept federal funds to put people in private insurance that's done in a way that honors the uniqueness of Florida. That's what we're pushing for. Candidly, Paul, I would tell you I don't know if the politics are right for that. I don't know if that's possible in an election year, but it doesn't mean we're going to push for it anyways.
Okay. Now the Chamber Foundation, which is your research arm, just produced a report that found more than 700,000 Floridians with disabilities are not working who may want to work. So what is the Chamber doing to address this issue, and what might the legislature do during the upcoming session?
Sure. So Paul, thank you, and I want to do the best I can in the short amount of time we have to tell you about this, and maybe there's a point in the future, maybe after session, where we could come back and talk about this more in depth. But I think it's important for you to know last year we started looking at poverty in Florida. And what we learned is 1 out of 6 Floridians currently are in poverty. 1 out of 4 children are living in poverty. And I say that to say our foundation has really started to look at what is causing this and how do we create economic opportunity for individuals and families that are living below the poverty line, especially people who are born into generational poverty. And I give you that as a backdrop. About midway through last year, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at the Able Trust's 25th year anniversary. And I talked about the importance. We had 300,000 open jobs in Florida. And as the report mentions that we just released this morning, there are 700,000 Floridians who have unique abilities, who might be able to enter the workforce. So as we have 300,000 open jobs, 700,000 people who may be able to fill those jobs, we need to double down our efforts about matchmaking. So let me put it in a different perspective. The unemployment rate in Florida is hovering around 5% statewide. The data that's available that we released this morning, if you look at the top 40 counties from a population standpoint, out of our 67, that's where the data is available from, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is over 18%. So it's almost, you can call it 3 to 4 times as high as the unemployment rate in general. And so what can the legislature do about this? The good news is right here in Orlando, President Gardner has been a visible champion for legislation that would provide equal opportunities, if you will. In fact, we would like to see incentives created for businesses to take a second look. We would like to find a way for families who have kids with special abilities to learn about employers. As an example, I think another thing that we announced this morning, Paul, is we're going to lead by example. And we have already made a decision to hire a young woman who is incredibly gifted with special abilities. She is going to run a statewide internship program for us where we are going to invite, and we already have 2 local chambers of commerce who have agreed to hire Floridians with special abilities. And what we will be doing is we will be running a statewide internship program which will be matching employers who are interested with potential employees who have special abilities and special gifts. And so my hope is, regardless of what the legislature does, my hope is that the business community will set the example here, and that the next time I'm here I can report back to you that we've had success in matchmaking.
Do you feel like you have buy-in on this goal from the governor's office?
Yeah, I think that we do. Here's what I think. I think that if I think of the last half dozen times I've been here, speaking with you and your team here, one of the things that we're discovering is some of these issues just need more visibility. So when you look at our prison system, 75% of our prisoners in prison system, have below an 8th grade reading level. Half of the new prisoners in Florida have been in a Florida prison before. So whether we're looking at a group of our population who has special abilities, or whether we're looking at our prison system, or whether we're looking at what causes generational poverty, sometimes, and I would be the first to admit this, sometimes we get so focused on making Florida more competitive that it's not until you sit back and look at the data that our Florida Chamber Foundation reports. More than half of our kids in public schools are on free and reduced lunch. The business community has an opportunity to put our money where its mouth is and break this cycle of generational poverty. And so I think the buy-in from the governor's office, from the cabinet, from the House, from the Senate, I think the buy-in is there. I think our focus needs to be on raising the awareness that at the same time we're trying to provide targeted incentives and record investments in transportation and create a smarter water policy and trying to fix our broken legal system, we also have to make sure we're making the right investments in the right policy to create economic opportunities for people who haven't had them.
We're approaching the end of our time, but we have time for a couple of more questions. One of the ones I wanted to touch on with you was the idea from the Senate President in waiting, Joe Negron, of investing a lot more in higher education in Florida. How does the Chamber feel about that?
Yeah, so I think obviously, like all issues, it's a fantastic idea to invest in education. And I would, Paul, remind you, we have a focus in 4 parts of education, right? We have an early learning alliance that's looking at pre-K and the early years. We have a focus on K-12. What should we do to make our public schools more competitive? We have a big focus on what we call Zone 3, which is higher education, colleges, universities, both public and private. And then, of course, the 4th area is lifelong learning. Think of CareerSource Florida. They're rated #1 in the United States by the U.S. Chamber for training our workforce. So when we remember our 28 community colleges, we graduate more 2-year degrees than any other state in the nation. We have more people going from a 2-year school to a 4-year school and going on to get their degree than any other state in the nation. So when we look at investments in higher education, what we're really talking about is investing in the next generation of our workforce. So when you look at UCF as an example right here, look at the research and development that's coming out of UCF, whether it's modeling and simulation, whether it's actually healthcare. I was over there 2 months ago and I was very impressed with what's happening with healthcare research at UCF. We're talking about, we're not just talking about sending kids to our colleges and universities so that they get a better education. We're actually talking about tying it into the local infrastructure of what's going on in the local economy. So more dollars for higher education if we can remember that performance funding is the right answer if we tie funding to what the business community ultimately needs. Remember, when I was here a few months ago speaking at the State Board of Education, calling for higher standards, and that no matter what we do, we must keep the A through F grading scale in Florida. You can imagine how many people criticize me for why does the business community engage in education issues. Well, whether it's helping kids before they enter kindergarten, or whether it's helping our K through 12 system, or in this case, investing in a higher education system that is going to train people for future Florida jobs, that President Negron has it exactly right. What we need to make sure is that as we look at community colleges, right? I'm a product of a community college. I then went on to the University of Georgia. We have to look at the importance of community colleges. We have to look at the importance of our state colleges, our state universities, our private universities. And we have to look at it as a system. Because keep in mind, and I'll end this point by saying this, even though we're at about a 5% unemployment rate, and even though we created 250,000 jobs in Florida in 2015, 1 out of every 11 American jobs created were created in Florida, we're going to create another 200,000 jobs in Florida in 2016, according to our chief economist. The point I would want to make, though, is right now, as I'm sitting here with you, we have 300,000 approximately open jobs in Florida today. So we have to be careful that we don't mistake investing more money in education with making sure that the curriculum, the degrees, or in some cases certifications, not degrees, are actually tied to what Florida employers are going to need, or else we'll be producing more graduates that can't find jobs in Florida. And there's no sense investing taxpayer money in degrees that are not going to keep these kids in Florida.
Now, you have a statewide focus, of course, in your position, but before we conclude, I need to ask you, because it's such an important issue locally for a lot of folks, whether or not the Chamber has any position on UCF creating a downtown campus in Orlando.
Yeah, we don't have a position on a regional issue. If the statewide university system thinks that it's important to do this in downtown Orlando, I trust Marshall Kreiser, who runs the university system. I trust the Board of Governors there. They're looking out for the entire system. So whether it's Florida Poly that they may need more resources, or whether it's USF in Tampa or FSU or UF or right here at UCF, the important part of your question is an acknowledgement, Paul, that universities are actually part of economic development. And so if I could do one thing on this subject, it would not be to weigh in about whether we should do this in Orlando or shouldn't do something in another part of Florida. The key is economic development is about the entire ecosystem. So putting a campus in downtown Orlando would fundamentally recharge and change the economic development that goes on around that campus. And it cannot be viewed by taxpayers and voters and policymakers as an education-only issue. This is what the 6 pillars are all about, Paul. You have to look at education, economic development, infrastructure, you have quality of life, you have to look at everything in total. And if this region and the statewide Board of Governors believes that it meets those criteria, then that's what we should do with that investment.
Right. All right. Well, we are out of time. We certainly appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
your answers to all of our questions. For the Orlando Sentinel, I'm Paul Owens.